Recently in Guatemala, the United Nations asked citizens to share photos, stories, and even draw pictures accounting for their experiences of human rights abuses by the government. Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Robin Hoecker from DePaul University joins me in examining the role of visual narratives in overcoming past traumas and leading societies forward to a more democratic future. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Robin Hoecker, to discuss visual narrative and trauma recovery. Dr. Hoecker is currently teaching at DePaul University, has her Ph.D. in Media Technology and Society and a background in journalism. Welcome,
Thanks
Robin.
for having me.
I'd like to start by talking about the work that you did that was published in the Journal of Narrative Inquiry about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in Peru and Guatemala. Maybe you could give us some background about why they needed a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in those two countries.
Sure. So Peru is one of about 40 countries that's had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they're generally formed by a government to examine a period of human rights abuse in the past. So it has to be a limited period of time that they're looking at, and it has to be a pattern of human rights abuses over time. So many countries in Latin America have had truth commissions. I was most interested in Peru specifically because they had a lot of photography in their truth commissions work. So several commissions have used visuals in different ways, and I was very interested in Peru because of the photography aspect.
So in Peru it would have been roughly 1980 to 2000 when there was a military junta of some sort.
Yes.
And there were human rights violations against the indigenous, the labor, I mean, what's the background here?
Yeah, so it was the context of the Cold War and the conflict between kind of leftist armed groups and the government who were mostly operating in the more rural areas. So the rural, more indigenous communities who don't speak Spanish were the ones who were most affected by the violence.
So the violence by Shining Path, which was the guerrilla group, and the government, or primarily by the government? Because in Guatemala, which was the other country that you looked at, you're talking about a longer period of time from late 60s to 90s maybe. But that was more just the government's repression of the indigenous population, is that correct?
Yeah, and so that makes Peru a little bit different from those other countries that I talked about. In the other countries like Argentina or Guatemala, for example, it was mostly the government forces who were found to be responsible for the violence. In Peru, it was actually the Shining Path, so the armed leftist group, that was found to have committed more of the crimes, although government forces also committed abuses as well.
So the purpose of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, most of us probably know about the one in South Africa. After decades of apartheid, Mandela gets elected president, there's a change in apartheid, and they have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But in all of the 40 cases, what's the primary purpose? Why do you have one of these Truth and Reconciliation operations?
Sure, so the phrase you hear all the time is never again. So in Spanish it's nunca más. Yeah. And the idea is that in order to prevent this kind of violence from happening again, you really have to understand why it happened in the first place and really get into what were the forces at play, who were the main characters in this story, where did systems of justice and accountability break down, and kind of how can you prevent that from happening again is the goal.
I want to get to the visual narrative part because that's what your work was around, but I do have a question about the Truth and Reconciliation, about never again. It strikes me that one of the things often the Truth and Reconciliation Commission will do, it's not about guilt, it's not about actions, it's not about what you might say sentencing. It's simply, this happened, we don't want it happened again, we'll be nice to each other. My question is, why is it that the victims for 20 years in Peru, or the victims for 30 or 40 years in Guatemala, or for decades in apartheid, are expected to reconcile without any guilt. In fact, in some cases, soldiers that had committed atrocities were guaranteed that they would not be prosecuted for the crimes they committed just so that they could have the testimony. That just doesn't seem ethically, it doesn't balance for me.
Sure, and that's been a criticism that's been leveled at truth commissions, and I have to say that all truth commissions are different in that respect.
Yes.
So South Africa was kind of famous for kind of exchanging testimony for amnesty. So if you testified and said, I did these things, you would get that in exchange for not being prosecuted. And so that was a criticism of that particular truth commission, and different truth commissions have had different perspectives on that in terms of whether or not the testimonies and the evidence that's gathered can be used to prosecute individual people. In general, I think the efforts in cases where they do actually prosecute people, the goal is to really find the people who were the architects, really the people at the top.
As opposed to the people that were carrying out the orders because they're not making the decisions. So.
Exactly. And so, yeah, so different truth commissions have had different perspectives.
So in the case of Guatemala, I understand the truth commissions actually split at some point. There was one from the United Nations and one from the Catholic Church, and part of it was this disagreement over whether or not there should be prosecutions, and also a disagreement over whether or not we should look at the truth of individual acts versus the truth of a structure of a structure of impunity and violence. So.
Yeah, the Guatemalan case is really interesting because, like you said, they couldn't agree on whether they would name names in that case. And so the Catholic Church actually formed their own commission that filed their report early, and they did name names, like very, very specifically. This person, was accused of this, and this person is accused of this. They did illustrations instead of photography, and interestingly, illustrations is usually an anonymous medium. Like, it's easier to make it more general, but they actually wrote the names underneath the drawings to
individuals that were abused or subject to violence would have the picture, and then they would say who the person was.
Yeah, they would say General so-and-so, is accused of doing this, and General so-and-so is responsible for this. And then usually you think of photography as being more specific to an individual person, but there were ways that you could photograph people in silhouette where you don't show their face, where that would keep some people anonymous. But going back to Guatemala, you were saying that yeah, so the Catholic Church created this whole other commission that did name names, but then the United Nations one focused more on structural barriers. And the big takeaway from that one, that they focused on the structures, was that they concluded that genocide had occurred. And genocide is, like, with a capital G, a big word when you actually use that term.
So that Truth Commission said that genocide had occurred.
Yes.
Due to the existing government that was running things in Guatemala for 20 years.
So taking the systemic approach rather than focusing on the individuals, they actually had a kind of a more severe takeaway, assessment. And some people argued that, in fact, by the fact that they focused on the more structural problems, it was actually more powerful. That commission actually.
Did they include the role of the U.S. in supporting the Rio Smart? Yes,
they did, and it's in the visuals too. There's a whole chapter in there about the U.S. involvement in overthrow of governments in the 50s and support for
no other
military
reason,
regimes.
truth commissions, whether there's reconciliation or not, I think can alert people to the actual conditions that have existed, and may also explain things as varied as a shining path, which is a physical response to the oppression, or something more mundane like the caravan from Honduras and Guatemala. I mean, if you were to look at the reports of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you would be surprised that there weren't more people that left during this period because of the structural abuse, including the aid from the U.S. I'd like to move now to talk about the visual narrative, because you made a couple of allusions to this. So people tell their stories. This happened to me. My house was burned. My husband was kidnapped. He was killed, or I was tortured. A story, right? But visuals sometimes are able to express those stories more, what would you say, dramatically? Are you going to say more accurately? Are you going to say more truthfully? What's the whole function of a visual narrative in this process?
I think it's just different. and that our brains process visual information very differently than they do text or oral information. And if you think about human history, we weren't mass literate until very recently, and so our brains are really supercharged in some ways to process visual information. So you can look at a picture, for example, or a drawing, and you can remember it, and you can draw a lot of information about what's going on there very, very quickly, where it would take you a lot longer to read a paragraph about that.
It may be more emotive.
Yes.
Right? You say if I write a paragraph, it takes me 2 pages to say you're wearing a blue sweater and you have a gold chain and right, your hair's parted. But when I look at you, or when somebody looks at us on TV, everything's taken in all at once, and in that sense it may be more powerful, it may be more emotive.
And people respond to the images as if they were actual people. So it might just be a photograph, it's on paper, it's 2-dimensional, but when you see a face, especially it's a face and the expression of emotion, you respond to that as if you're responding to an actual person.
Particularly in our current culture, where there's a decline in reading, a decline in print journalism, and an increase in visuals and videos and the use of that. So it would seem like this would be true for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission too, if its function is to report on what happened. The visuals may be, are they considered evidence, or are they considered the narrative as somebody's story? How do they fit in this whole truth attempt?
Sure, so photographs are connected with evidence. A lot of times people say because you have a picture of something, it automatically happened.
Cheap thing,
yeah. So, and in Peru especially, they used archives, all different types of archives. So they used police archives, they used military archives, they used photojournalism archives. They actually had photographs that the terrorist groups had taken of themselves, or photographers who were embedded with them. And I think considering all those different perspectives gave a certain amount of evidentiary backing to what they were doing.
Were there pictures that were taken by the population?
Were there? Yes.
Okay.
So some, yeah. And they were pictures that were taken at the time, while the conflict was actually happening. And that's a little bit different from Argentina, for example, who they went and they found the torture centers later and took pictures of these buildings in the present. And what Peru really did was take the photojournalistic archive from that time.
That happened in 1981, 1982, and so they could say this is what. So how does the visual work in terms of persuasive? I mean, I understand you're a journalist, but in communication we expand to talk about argument and rhetoric. How does a picture or a photo or a video work in terms of telling the story or making a claim? How does it work differently than a text?
So I tell my students, so I teach photojournalism classes, and I tell my students that a photograph is like a sentence. And when you put multiple images together, it's like making a paragraph or stringing together multiple paragraphs. Okay. And so you can use visuals to construct narratives in the same way that you would construct any narrative. So you have to have characters, you have to have setting, you have to have plot. So to establish character.
So a picture has all of these. Yeah.
Yeah, so especially the combination of pictures, right? So you can have more portrait pictures that focus on a person's face, that establish character. You can have setting, so a lot of the pictures in the Peruvian archive, for example, are in the highlands region, so you can tell automatically, where the violence was occurring, and then it eventually moved into the cities, and you can kind of see how that story changes over time by just looking at the backgrounds of the pictures. And then the plot, you see the way people are looking at each other in the frame, you can see all the tensions between groups, you see the actual physical violence. That is telling the story of what happened.
This may be a little bit off the track, but it's a question about photography. You say you teach photojournalism. Roland Barthes, who writes about semiotics, once argued that pictures don't reflect memories. He said pictures block memories, because we don't remember what happened, we remember the picture. So the picture becomes a construction. And I was taken by, you said a photograph's like a sentence. You construct this and you put several of them together and you make a paragraph. So the photograph itself is selected and the photograph itself is constructed. So I'm curious about if the Quechua people in Peru didn't have an opportunity to walk around with their cameras and flash cameras, how do they participate in the reconstruction of their lives for 20 years and they don't have any photographs to show for that?
So, I mean, I think that there's some truth in that a photo can replace a memory. And the interesting thing about Peru, for example, is that the population is so young that most of them are too young to really have any memory of this conflict, really, from a firsthand perspective. But what they're kind of doing is creating a collective memory for the whole country of, like, these are the important events and this is what happened, even for people who weren't alive or old enough to really understand what was going on at the time. But they're kind of giving
even that collective memory, though, one could argue that it's not so much a collective memory as it's a collective instruction of what we're supposed to remember.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that, but again, there's all these different ways to challenge it, right? And I mean, all of these truth commissions are controversial in some ways, right? It's not like there's a commission and everybody says, oh, okay, let's move on with our lives now. I mean, the truth commissions are contentious, and in some ways, that battle over which pictures are most important and you know what they represent is part of the process of the transition to democracy. So these truth commissions are always used in the transition from a military regime to a democratic regime. And in some ways, arguing about the pictures is a way to kind of practice the democratic process of hearing different points of view.
Yeah, rather than recognizing the photograph as the truth, right? It's telling us what happened. The photograph becomes an opening where we can have a dialogue and a discussion around, well, that's not telling the whole story, or you didn't see this picture, or outside of the frame, this is happening. Because I mean, we've all seen so many pictures where there's a frame, and we don't dispute that that's artificial, but in the case of the toppling of Hussein's statue in Iraq, we find out that it was staged. Or even in the iconic photo of Iwo Jima, we find out that that also was staged. So it's like, not that it isn't true, because even if it's staged, it's a photograph of that stage, but it prompts us to have a discussion, a debate, a dialogue over conflicting stories about what really happened. Does that take place as well?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important things that these images do, is give you a starting place to have that conversation. So there's a theory in communication called agenda setting theory that basically says that images or media don't tell you what to think; they tell you what to think about. Right.
And
so there's going to be
photographs would be what we should be thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah, or not that it's going. Everybody's going to have the same idea of what that conflict was or what happened and who was responsible. But at least everybody's talking about this conflict, right? There's all these different perspectives, and it's bringing the conflict to the public attention to be discussed.
One interesting thing that I noticed about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they had this visual narrative, and it became, I think it was put in museums, and it traveled around the country, and I read that in some Quechua towns that they didn't want it, and nobody went, because they didn't think it represented their experience. They thought it represented the experience of those that were closer to the photojournalists or whatever, which again, even though that may be true, it still suggests that there has to be a dialogue over what we're going to accept as the truth or the not truth.
For sure, and those, I mean, those challenges, the social divides, you know, those are going to be, it's hard to separate a project from that, right? It's going to reflect those divides as well because of who has cameras, who has the archives, who has...
Well, even in a larger sense, who sets up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and what its function is, because I mean, I guess we could discuss this, but to me the Peruvian government isn't a model of democracy from Fujimori on till today. So they set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You have to wonder if, because they select these photos and these things and want to focus on Shining Path as much as they do on the military, with its larger function is to suggest that the current government that launched this Reconciliation Commission is representing the will of the people and is in this transition phase headed for democracy. So it's a journalistic question, but it seems like the visual makes it more powerful. Sometimes more contentious, maybe less contentious for others, but
But I think you could say that happens everywhere, and in Peru there have been, you know, political swings to one side or the other, you know, and depending on who's in control, you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission might be supported more than, you know, when other groups are in control.
The difference is if the population, the citizens, have that media ability to take the picture. We have talked about Laquan McDonald, for example, or Michael Brown. The fact that somebody other than the commercial media journalists in the police department were able to take pictures, it changes that narrative because you actually are able to offer a story, which is not just your account versus some credible official, but it's your account that's bolstered by, here's some evidence, which is, in this case, video. But.
Mm-hmm. And I think different truth commissions have tried to reach out to those communities in different ways. So in Guatemala, again, they didn't use photography, but they used illustrations. Yeah. And the illustrations were based on people's testimonies. So, you know, the villagers' testimonies, and a lot of them were victims of violence, gave their testimonies, and then someone drew those scenes, which they can show different things than they could with a photograph, right? It was a lot of, like, the worst examples of abuse. There's no photographic record of that, right? So in the illustrations, they can draw that, right?
Very interesting. Yes.
They have the freedom to draw that because you can draw whatever you want.
Right.
When you're using photographs, you're restricted to some extent by the photographic archive, right? And who was taking pictures, who had control of the archive, all these things come into play. And they both have their own strengths and weaknesses because you can draw whatever you want. So then you have the argument of, well, did this really happen like this? Was this chair over here? Did it look like this? Whereas the photographs have that evidentiary connection to it. But.
So we've talked about a few things I had questions about, but I really want to get to an important part of your research and the publication, which was not just visual narratives, but its role in trauma recovery, how it aided in the recovery of 20 years of violence and human rights violations. So how do you understand, or how did you find that these visuals allowed people to move forward?
Sure. So the trauma and the narrative is really important part of the trauma recovery because they say that trauma is you get stuck in a traumatic experience and you can't get out of it. And so narrative becomes really important because it's what allows you to figure out how did I get into that situation and then how did I get out. So it allows you to construct a narrative around that event.
So you start to tell a story, this happened to me, but this is what happened before.
Yeah, and also what happens after, right? So it explains how did I get into this situation, but then also what happened after this. My life didn't stop in this one event, right? And that's kind of talking about an individual, but the same thing could be said about on a nationwide scale, you know, the story of the country didn't stop at this conflict, right? Like things happened that helped that conflict to arise, but then other things happened that helped the country move past that, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is part of that. And so that's what the visuals of these truth commissions do. They help construct that narrative of how the conflict started, and then also what happened afterwards that helps you kind of move through that.
I can understand how the visual narrative constructs what happened. As you said, all of the pictures from Shining Path or the government or individual pictures. I don't understand how the visual narrative can go after. What kind of pictures or what kind of visuals would exist that says, okay, that stopped last Tuesday and this is what we did on Thursday. I don't understand that part.
So, for example, in Guatemala, they actually included the Truth and Reconciliation process in the visuals. So they have people coming to tribunals and talking, giving their testimony. And in the Guatemalan one, they use the symbolism of the corn in the background. So the corn is all wilted in all the conflict pictures. And then afterwards, they have this kind of truth-telling. People are coming forward, and the corn starts to grow again, and the fields become more fertile, right?
It's like a good Lion King
in Peru,
movie.
I mean, there's a conclusion, right, to the story. And in Peru, they have the arrest of Abimel Guzman, who was the head of the Shining Path, right? So that photo is in the exhibit and in the book of kind of here were these characters and here's all the havoc that they wreaked throughout the country. But then, they went to jail, and other people went to jail, and so
Peruvian officials went to jail. Did Fujimori go to jail? Did the people that were in the government go to jail?
Yeah. So in some cases, yes, but these things go on. I mean, it's not so easily in one person solved. So we're still dealing with the aftermath of these conflicts, right? And that's where the story doesn't end entirely. So,
well, I think it's a great contribution what you put together here, despite questions people may have about truth and reconciliation commissions as effective. Certainly the power of visual narratives to help construct those stories, I think, has been well demonstrated. So thank you for that. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you, Dr. Robin Hoecker, for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.